She shared her husband with her own daughter, the most consanguineous mother of the Virginia mountains, deep in the remote highlands of southwestern Virginia, tucked between the rugged peaks and shrouded valleys of the Appalachian Range, lay a community that time had all but forgotten. The year was 1885, and while the Industrial Revolution was transforming America's cities with electric lights and telephone lines, the isolated settlement of Hollow Creek remained largely untouched by modern progress. Here, nestled in a narrow valley, flanked by dense forests of oak and hickory, lived the Thornhill family, whose blood-soaked legacy would eventually shock even the most hardened residents of Virginia's backcountry. Our story begins on a crisp autumn morning, when the mist hung heavy over the valley, cloaking the scattered cabins in an ethereal shroud. The Thornhill homestead stood apart from the others, perched higher up the mountainside, as if its occupants preferred distance from their neighbors. The cabin, built from hand-hewn logs by Ezra Thornhill's grandfather in the late 1700s, had weathered decades of harsh mountain winters. Its weathered exterior told a story of endurance, but concealed the disturbing truths that festered within its walls. Ezra Thornhill was a man of contradictions. Standing over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and calloused hands, he commanded respect through his imposing physical presence. At 48 years old, his once auburn hair had faded to a rusty gray, and deep lines etched his weather-beaten face. Despite his intimidating stature, Ezra was known as a skilled craftsman who fashioned intricate wooden furniture sought after by families throughout the county. What remained unknown to outsiders was the twisted family structure he had created within his isolated homestead. Martha Thornhill, Ezra's wife, moved slowly about the cabin's main room, her once youthful frame now bent from years of hard labor and childbearing. At 43, she appeared much older, her face a mask of resignation beneath her graying hair. Martha had given birth to 8 children, though only 5 had survived to adulthood. The most striking of these was their eldest daughter, Rebecca, who at 23 possessed the same amber eyes and high cheekbones that had once made Martha the most sought-after young woman in 3 counties. "Rebecca, fetch more water from the spring," Martha called, her voice devoid of the maternal warmth one might expect. Rebecca nodded silently, her movements mechanical as she took up the wooden buckets. She avoided her mother's gaze, a habit formed over years of unspoken tension. What observers might have noticed, had any ventured this far into the mountains, was the strange dynamic between Ezra and his eldest daughter. The lingering glances, the way Rebecca flinched when her father entered a room, and most tellingly, the hollow look in Martha's eyes whenever the 3 were together. For in this remote homestead, far from the reach of law or church, a terrible arrangement had taken shape. Ezra Thornhill had taken his own daughter as a second wife, with Martha's broken acquiescence. The practice had not begun with them. The Thornhills represented the darkest outcome of generations of isolation and intermarriage among a small pool of mountain families. Ezra himself was the product of first cousins, as was Martha, whose maiden name had also been Thornhill, from a distant branch of the same family tree. This pattern of consanguinity had been reinforced over decades, as geographic isolation and suspicion of outsiders limited marriage prospects to an ever-shrinking circle of relations. Dr. James Morrison, the county physician, who occasionally ventured into the remote hollows to treat the mountain folk, had long observed the troubling patterns in certain isolated families. The effects of continuous interbreeding become evident in various physical and mental manifestations. It written in his medical journal. Reduced stature, distinctive facial features, and in some cases, diminished mental capacity appear with increasing frequency where the same bloodlines repeatedly converge. The Thornhill children exhibited several of these traits. The youngest son, 12-year-old Silas, had been born with a malformed foot that caused him to walk with a pronounced limp. The 17-year-old twins, Elijah and Esther, were unnaturally small for their age, with identical piercing blue eyes set too close together in narrow faces. Only Rebecca and her brother Samuel, at 20, had escaped obvious physical markers of their inbred heritage, though both carried the burden in their blood. Samuel had been the only one to recognize the wrongness in their family. 2 years earlier, after a violent confrontation with his father over Rebecca's treatment, he had fled the mountain, vowing to return with help. The family had not heard from him since, and Ezra had forbidden any mention of his name. But Rebecca silently held on to hope that her brother had not forgotten them. The Thornhill family's isolation was both geographical and self-imposed. While other mountain families occasionally ventured into the nearby town of Cedar Ridge for supplies or to sell their crafts, Ezra limited these excursions to twice yearly. He preferred to trade directly with Jacob Miller, a peddler who made monthly rounds through the mountain communities, exchanging Ezra's woodwork for essential supplies and, more importantly, information from the outside world. It was through Miller that the first whispers about the Thornhills began to spread beyond their hollow. The peddler's observant eyes had noted Rebecca's swelling belly during his spring visit, and the way Martha had positioned herself between her daughter and the visitor, as if shielding a shameful secret. By summer, when Miller returned to find both Martha and Rebecca nursing infants born mere weeks apart, he connected the disturbing dots. "There's something ungodly happening up at the Thornhill place," Miller confided to Sheriff Thomas Blackwood during one of his stops in Cedar Ridge. "2 babies, born to mother and daughter, and they favor Ezra something fierce." Sheriff Blackwood, a practical man with little interest in the affairs of the mountain folk unless they disturbed the peace in his town, merely grunted in response. "Mountain ways are their own," he said dismissively. "Long as they keep to themselves, it ain't our concern." But the sheriff's disinterest would not protect the Thornhill secret forever. Forces were already in motion that would expose the family's disturbing practices to the harsh light of public scrutiny. Samuel Thornhill had not disappeared, but had made his way to Roanoke, where he'd found work on the railroad and begun saving money. More importantly, he'd met Dr. William Calloway, a physician with the state health department who had developed an interest in the effects of consanguinity in isolated mountain communities. As autumn painted the mountainsides in brilliant hues of red and gold, Samuel prepared to return home, accompanied by Dr. Calloway and a journalist named Edward Pierce from the Roanoke Daily Herald. Their investigation would soon uncover generations of intermarriage that had culminated in Ezra's unspeakable relationship with his daughter, a relationship that had produced not 1 but 2 children, with a third on the way. Back at the Thornhill cabin, unaware of the approaching reckoning, Martha stared vacantly into the fire as Rebecca rocked her infant son. Beside her, Martha's own baby daughter slept in a crude wooden cradle. The 2 women rarely spoke anymore, bound together in a silent complicity born of shared trauma and the inescapable bonds of blood. "Winter's coming early this year," Marta finally murmured, breaking the heavy silence. "I can feel it in my bones." Rebecca nodded, her eyes never leaving her child's face. What neither woman voiced was their shared fear of another harsh mountain winter. Another season trapped in the cabin with Ezra and the terrible reality they had come to accept as normal. Little did they know that before the first snow fell, their isolated world would be forever changed by the return of the son who had escaped it. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss the shocking truth about America's most hidden families. Subscribe now to uncover forgotten histories that were deliberately buried from public view. The investigation that would ultimately expose the Thornhill family began in earnest when Samuel returned to Cedar Ridge in October of 1885. The young man had changed considerably during his 2 years away from the mountains. His rough homespun clothing had been replaced by store-bought attire, and his once shaggy hair was neatly trimmed. But the most notable change was in his bearing. He carried himself with a newfound confidence born of life beyond the confines of Hollow Creek. Dr. William Calloway, who accompanied Samuel on his return, was a distinguished-looking gentleman in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. As a physician with the Virginia Department of Public Health, he had spent years documenting the medical consequences of isolation and intermarriage in mountain communities. His interest in the Thornhill family was both professional and humanitarian. "The patterns of consanguinity I have observed in these mountains are some of the most concentrated in the Commonwealth," Dr. Calloway explained to Edward Pierce as their wagon jostled along the rutted mountain road. Pierce, a lean, sharp-featured man in his 30s, scribbled notes as the doctor spoke. Isolated populations naturally tend toward intermarriage over generations, but certain families have embraced the practice to a disturbing degree. Samuel, driving the wagon, kept his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "My grandfather used to say, 'Thornhill blood stays strongest when it runs back into itself,'" he said quietly. "He married his half-sister. My father married his first cousin. But what he's done with Rebecca ... double quotes, his knuckles whitened on the reins." The wagon fell silent as they continued their ascent. The civilized world seemed to fall away with each mile, the forest growing denser and the trail narrower until it barely accommodated their vehicle. By mid-afternoon, they reached a crude wooden bridge spanning a swift-flowing creek. "Hollow Creek," Samuel announced. "Thornhill land begins here." As they crossed the bridge, Pierce noticed a crude wooden sign nailed to a tree, "Get out," below it. Someone had carved a rough pentagram, not out of any genuine occult belief, Pierce would later learn, but as a deliberate warning to superstitious travelers. "My father's way of discouraging visitors," Samuel explained, noticing the journalist's gaze. The Thornhill homestead came into view as they rounded a bend in the trail, a main cabin with 2 smaller outbuildings surrounded by a split-rail fence. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the stone chimney, the only sign of life. The confrontation that followed would be recounted in vivid detail in Pierce's subsequent article. Ezra Thornhill emerged from the cabin with a rifle in hand, his face darkening with rage at the sight of his prodigal son. Behind him, Martha and Rebecca appeared in the doorway, both clutching infants to their chests. The twins, Elijah and Esther, peered wide-eyed from a window, while young Silas hobbled forward to stand beside his father. "You ain't welcome here," Ezra growled, raising his rifle. Dr. Calloway stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Mr. Thornhill, I'm Dr. William Calloway with the Virginia Department of Public Health. We've come out of concern for your family's well-being." Ezra's response was unprintable in Pierce's newspaper account, but the journalist would later describe it as a stream of invective that would have made a sailor blush. The mountain man's fury escalated when he noticed Pierce documenting the exchange in his notebook. What prevented violence that day was an unexpected intervention from Martha. Moving with uncharacteristic decisiveness, she stepped in front of her husband and placed a hand on the rifle barrel, pushing it toward the ground. "Enough, Ezra," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "Let them in." The shock of his normally submissive wife's defiance momentarily silenced Ezra. In that crucial moment, Samuel moved forward to embrace his mother, and the fragile standoff shifted in the visitor's favor. Inside the cabin, the full extent of the Thornhill family's situation became apparent. The main room was clean but sparse, with handmade furniture arranged around a central fireplace. Faded photographs and pressed flowers in frames adorned the rough-hewn walls, attempts by Martha to bring beauty to their isolated existence. But no decorative touches could disguise the underlying wrongness of the household. Rebecca sat in a corner, cradling her infant son while staring vacantly at the floor. The resemblance between her child and the baby in Martha's arms was unmistakable. Both bore the distinctive Thornhill features, evidence of their shared paternity. More disturbing still was the visible swell of Rebecca's abdomen, indicating another pregnancy well underway. Dr. Calloway conducted a careful examination of all family members, documenting his findings in a leather-bound notebook. The twins, despite being 17, had the intellectual development of much younger children. Young Silas, in addition to his malformed foot, exhibited signs of what Calloway termed developmental insufficiency. Both Martha and Rebecca showed symptoms of prolonged psychological trauma, though neither would speak openly in Ezra's presence. During a rare moment when Ezra stepped outside to split firewood, Martha whispered to her son, "It didn't start with your father, Samuel. His father before him took his sister as wife after your grandmother died. The Thornhills have always kept the bloodline pure." Her voice held no pride in this declaration, only a bone-deep weariness. Pierce, observing the interaction, noted the complex dynamics at play. This was not simply a case of one man's depravity, but the culmination of generations of isolation and intermarriage. The Thornhills had gradually separated themselves from wider society's evolving moral standards, creating their own insular world where such relationships became normalized. The investigation revealed that the Thornhill family tree was less a branching structure than a tangled web, with the same names appearing repeatedly across generations. DNA testing did not exist in 1885, but Dr. Calloway estimated that due to generations of consanguineous marriages, Ezra and Martha shared approximately as much genetic material as half-siblings, making their children already highly inbred before Ezra's relationship with Rebecca added another devastating layer of consanguinity. As evening approached, tensions in the cabin reached a breaking point. Ezra, growing increasingly agitated by the outsider's presence, ordered them to leave. When Dr. Calloway attempted to explain the health risks faced by the children due to inbreeding, Ezra exploded in rage. "My family, my blood, my rules," he shouted, overturning a chair. "We've kept our bloodline strong, while you city folk weaken yourselves with foreign marriages." The confrontation might have turned violent had it not been for an unexpected development. Rebecca, who had remained silent throughout the day, suddenly rose to her feet, still holding her infant son. With quiet dignity, she addressed her father for perhaps the first time in years. "I'm leaving with Samuel," she stated simply, "taking my son and Esther." Martha, as if awakened from a long trance, moved to stand beside her daughter. "The children come with us, Ezra, all of them." The stunned silence that followed was broken by young Silas, who hobbled to his mother's side. The twins, sensing the shift in power, gradually edged away from their father toward the protective circle forming around Martha and Rebecca. Ezra's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You can't take my blood from me," he snarled, lunging toward Rebecca. What happened next would be debated in Cedar Ridge for years to come. Samuel stepped between his father and sister, and in the ensuing struggle, Ezra was knocked backward. His head struck the stone hearth with a sickening crack, and he lay motionless on the cabin floor. In the chaotic aftermath, Dr. Calloway confirmed what was already apparent. Ezra Thornhill was dead. The official report would later rule the death accidental, a conclusion supported by Sheriff Blackwood's cursory investigation. Few in the county shed tears for Ezra once the full story emerged. That night, as a cold rain battered the cabin roof, the remaining Thornhills made their preparations to leave the only home most of them had ever known. Martha, moving with newfound purpose, packed the few belongings worth salvaging. Rebecca, her face showing the first hints of emotion, relief mingled with apprehension, prepared the children for travel. Pierce, observing this transformation, wrote in his notebook, "Like prisoners released from a long confinement, they move with a mixture of disbelief and determination." The younger children, having known no other reality, seemed confused by the sudden disruption of their limited world. Only Samuel and Rebecca fully comprehend the magnitude of this night's events, the end of a lineage defined by its refusal to branch outward. By dawn, they were ready to depart. Ezra's body, wrapped in a homespun blanket, was left for Sheriff Blackwood to retrieve later. As the wagon pulled away from the cabin, Martha did not look back at the home where she had spent 25 years in a prison of blood ties. Rebecca, sitting beside her with one child in her arms and another growing within her, stared straight ahead at the narrow trail leading down the mountain, the path to a different future. The Thornhill case would soon send shockwaves through Virginia's society, prompting increased scrutiny of isolated mountain communities and their practices. But for the family at the center of the storm, the immediate concern was simpler: how to rebuild lives untethered from the toxic legacy of their blood. 6 months after the events at the Thornhill homestead, Dr. William Calloway presented his findings to the Virginia Medical Society in Richmond. The grand hall of the Jefferson Hotel was filled to capacity with physicians, academics, and government officials, all drawn by the sensational case that had captured public attention through Edward Pierce's newspaper articles. Dr. Calloway, standing before an easel displaying family trees and medical diagrams, addressed the assembled crowd with clinical detachment. "Gentlemen, what I present today is perhaps the most extensively documented case of multi-generational consanguinity in modern medical literature. The Thornhill family represents the culmination of at least 5 generations of intermarriage, culminating in a situation where a father with an already significantly inbred genetic makeup engaged in procreation with both his first cousin wife and their daughter. Simultaneously, a murmur rippled through the audience. Though Pierce's articles had described the situation, hearing it laid out in scientific terms by a respected physician heightened its impact. The medical consequences observed in the Thornhill offspring follow patterns consistent with our understanding of consanguinity risks, Callaway continued, turning to a chart. Increased incidence of congenital malformations, reduced stature, diminished cognitive function, and higher infant mortality, all present in varying degrees within the SIB ship. The presentation continued with detailed documentation of each. Thornhill child's condition. Silas's foot deformity. The twins' developmental delays. The infant's distinctive facial features that medical science would later identify as characteristic of inbreeding. Prominent brow ridges, closely set eyes, and asymmetrical facial structures. Most disturbing were Dr. Callaway's findings regarding Rebecca's children. The male infant, product of father-daughter procreation, exhibits more severe manifestations than his half-siblings. This aligns with our understanding that the genetic risks compound with each generation of consanguinity. In the audience sat Samuel Thornhill, almost unrecognizable in a proper suit, his hair neatly combed. Beside him, a young woman from the Presbyterian Aid Society that had taken in the Thornhill family held Martha's infant daughter. Martha herself had chosen not to attend, finding the clinical discussion of her family too painful to bear. After the presentation, during the question period, a physician from Baltimore rose. Dr. Callaway, while the medical implications are clear, what can you tell us about the psychological factors that allowed such a situation to develop and persist? Callaway adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully. Isolation breeds its own reality, gentlemen. The Thornhills lived 3 generations without meaningful contact with evolving societal standards. What began as pragmatic intermarriage in a limited population gradually normalized increasingly close relations. Each generation's threshold for acceptable consanguinity shifted further from the norm, from the back of the hall. Edward Pierce called out an unscheduled question. What of Rebecca Thornhill herself? How does a young woman come to accept such a role within her family? A hush fell over the assembly. It was the question many had pondered, but few had voiced directly. I don't presume to speak for Miss Thornhill, Callaway responded, carefully. But in environments of complete control and isolation, particularly when patterns are established in childhood, the unthinkable can become normalized. What we outsiders perceive as obvious moral boundaries become blurred when one has never been exposed to alternative perspectives. Samuel stood up, his face flushed. My sister was not given a choice, he stated firmly, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent hall. None of us were. We were born into a world created by generations before us, with no knowledge that other possibilities existed. With that declaration, he took the infant from his companion and walked out, his dignity palpable in every step. The medical presentation marked a turning point in how the scientific community viewed consanguinity in isolated populations. Rather than dismissing such cases as mere mountain peculiarities, the Thornhill case prompted more systematic research into the genetic and social factors involved. For Rebecca, scientific explanations offered little comfort as she struggled with her complex reality. Now living in a modest home in Roanoke provided by the Presbyterian Mission Society, she spent her days caring for her son while awaiting the birth of her second child. The society ladies who had taken in the Thornhill family treated her with a mixture of Christian charity and barely concealed fascination, as if she were both victim and curiosity. "They look at me as though I'm some strange creature," Rebecca confided to Samuel during one of his visits. "Not quite human in their eyes." "They don't understand," Samuel replied, watching his nephew play on a handmade quilt. "How could they? Do you think I'll ever be more than this story to anyone?" Rebecca asked, resting a hand on her swollen abdomen. "More than the mountain girl who had her father's children." "You already are," Samuel assured her. "To me, to mother, to your son. And there will be others who see beyond it, given time." When Rebecca's labor began in late April, complications arose immediately. Dr. Calloway, who had taken a personal interest in the family's medical care, was summoned urgently. After 36 hours of difficult labor, Rebecca delivered a daughter with evident physical abnormalities, a cleft palate, malformed hands, and concerning neurological signs. "The child's condition is grave," Dr. Calloway informed Martha as Rebecca slept, exhausted from the ordeal. "Her chances of survival beyond infancy are minimal." Martha, who had aged a decade in 6 months, received this news with quiet resignation. "Another price paid for our blood," she murmured. The infant survived just 11 days, slipping away peacefully in Rebecca's arms one spring morning. They buried her in the Presbyterian cemetery under a small stone marked only "Thornhill Infant, May 1886. Rebecca, still physically weak from the difficult birth, stood dry-eyed at the graveside, her expression unreadable. That evening, as Martha prepared a simple supper in their borrowed home, Rebecca made an unexpected request. "I want to tell my story," she announced. "Not Dr. Calloway's medical case, not Mr. Pierce's sensational tale. My story, in my words." Martha looked up from the stove, surprised. "To what purpose, child?" "So others might understand. So isolated girls in other hollows might know they aren't alone. So people see us as more than just ... specimens." Rebecca's voice grew stronger with each word. This decision would lead to an unprecedented collaboration between Rebecca and Edward Pierce. Over several weeks, the journalist recorded Rebecca's account of life in Hollow Creek, the generations of intermarriage that had preceded her birth, and the gradual normalization of increasingly consanguineous relationships. "My earliest memories are of being told how special Thornhill blood was," Rebecca dictated as Pierce's pencil flew across the page. "Outsiders would weaken our special gifts," Grandfather claimed. "He could predict weather changes in his bones, heal livestock with his hands. These powers came from keeping our bloodline pure, or so we were taught to believe." She described how her father had first approached her shortly after her 16th birthday, presenting the arrangement as both family tradition and sacred duty. He spoke of ancient royal families who maintained their divine right through blood purity, of how the strongest bloodlines in history kept their power through such unions. Most disturbing was her description of her mother's role. She didn't stop him because she couldn't imagine stopping him. In our isolated world, his word was absolute law, and perhaps she thought sharing his attention would lessen her own burden. "We never spoke of it directly until the day we left the mountain." The resulting series of articles, published under the title "From the Valley of Blood, Rebecca Thornhill's Testimony," created a sensation throughout Virginia and beyond. Unlike Pierce's earlier reporting or Dr. Calloway's clinical analysis, Rebecca's first-person account humanized the story in ways that deeply affected readers. Letters poured in to the newspaper offices, many from women sharing their own stories of isolation and abuse in remote communities. Several correspondents reported similar situations of consanguinity in their own extended families, previously kept as shameful secrets. A state senator called for increased educational outreach to isolated mountain communities, while church organizations mobilize to extend their missions to the most remote hollows. I want you to leave a comment right now saying, "These hidden family histories need to be told so no one suffers in silence again." This simple act will help others find the strength to share their own stories of survival. By autumn of 1886, the Thornhill case had evolved from sensational news to a catalyst for broader social change. In the Virginia state legislature, lawmakers debated new measures to extend educational and medical services to isolated mountain communities. The Presbyterian and Methodist churches expanded their mountain missions, focusing particularly on areas with histories of extreme isolation. For the Thornhill family themselves, adapting to life beyond their mountain hollow proved challenging in unexpected ways. Martha, after decades of isolation, found the bustle of even a small city like Roanoke overwhelming. Simple tasks like shopping in a general store or attending church services caused her intense anxiety. She rarely ventured out of the modest home provided by the church mission, preferring to maintain the same daily routines she had followed for decades, albeit in a new setting. The children adjusted with varying degrees of success. Young Silas, despite his physical disability, thrived in the mission school, revealing an aptitude for mathematics that had gone unrecognized in Hollow Creek. The twins, Elijah and Esther, struggled more significantly. Their developmental delays became more apparent in comparison to other children their age, and they remained highly dependent on Martha and Rebecca for basic care. Rebecca's son James, now approaching his first birthday, showed concerning signs that Dr. Calloway monitored closely. His development lagged noticeably behind other infants his age, and certain physical characteristics, the close-set eyes, the distinctive shape of his skull, marked him visibly as a child of close consanguinity. Rebecca devoted herself entirely to his care, fiercely protective of the child that others viewed as the living embodiment of the family's tragedy. "He is not his origins," she insisted firmly, when a well-meaning mission lady suggested placing him in a specialized institution. "He is a child, my child, and he stays with me." Samuel had perhaps the most successful transition. Having already spent 2 years away from the mountain before the family's exodus, he had established himself as a capable worker at the railroad yard. His colleagues knew nothing of his background until the newspaper articles appeared, creating a brief period of uncomfortable scrutiny that eventually faded as other sensations captured public attention. In September, a letter arrived that would force the family to confront their past in an unexpected way. It came from Cedar Ridge, addressed to Martha in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. Sheriff Blackwood had discovered another Thornhill cabin deep in the forest beyond Hollow Creek, occupied by Ezra's elderly uncle Jebediah and his wife, niece Sarah. The elderly couple, learning of Ezra's death through belated mountain gossip, claimed ancestral rights to the original Thornhill homestead and had moved in. They're living in that cabin and saying all sorts of wild things about you folks, Sheriff Blackwood wrote bluntly, claiming you murdered Ezra for his property and ran off with his rightful heirs. There's talk of them challenging the doctor's ruling of accidental death. This unexpected development forced Martha and Samuel to return to Cedar Ridge to address the claims, a journey neither had anticipated making again. Rebecca remained in Roanoke with the children, unable to face returning to the site of her trauma. The journey back to the mountains revealed how quickly nature reclaims abandoned human spaces. The trail to Hollow Creek had already grown over in places, requiring Samuel to clear brush so their wagon could pass. When they finally reached the homestead, they found the cabin occupied by Jebediah Thornhill, a wizened man of 75 with the same distinctive family features exaggerated by age and hardship, and his wife Sarah, 20 years his junior, but looking equally weathered, come to take what else is ours. Jebediah challenged from the cabin porch, his rheumy eyes narrowed suspiciously. Martha, drawing on newfound strength, approached him directly. "We've come to settle matters legally, Jebediah. This property has been in Ezra's name since his father died, and now passes to his heirs." The confrontation that followed revealed the extent to which the practice of consanguinity had permeated the extended Thornhill clan. Jebediah spoke openly of 5 generations of strategic intermarriage designed to concentrate both property and what he called the old powers within a tight bloodline. "Your husband have understood the importance of keeping gifts in the family," Jebediah told Martha accusingly. "Now you've scattered his blood to the winds. Mixing with outsiders will dilute what makes Thornhill special." Sheriff Blackwood, present as a precautionary measure, listened with increasing discomfort as Jebediah expounded on the family's history. "My grandfather took his daughter and his wife after his first wife died in childbirth," the old man declared without shame. "Their son married his half-sister. Each generation kept the blood stronger, purer." Martha's response was quiet but firm, and each generation produced more children with afflictions. More infants in tiny graves behind the cabin. More minds that never developed fully. "That's the truth your family tradition never acknowledged, Jebediah." The sheriff, having heard enough, intervened to establish the legal facts. Ezra had died without a will, but under Virginian law, his property would pass to his widow and legitimate children. Jebediah's claim had no legal standing, regardless of family traditions or verbal agreements that might have existed between the men. "The Commonwealth's laws govern here, not Thornhill customs," Blackwood stated firmly, making a point of placing his hand on his sidearm as he spoke. Recognizing defeat, Jebediah made a final, unexpected offer. "I have something you might want before you go." From inside the cabin, Sarah emerged, carrying a wooden box, intricately carved with intertwining patterns. "The family records," Jebediah explained, "going back to 1740, when the first Thornhill settled this valley. Names, births, marriages, deaths, all kept faithful." Martha accepted the box with visible trepidation. Inside lay a leather-bound volume filled with cramped handwriting, documenting the Thornhill lineage in meticulous detail, including unions that would never have been recorded in any church or courthouse register. Accompanying the book were crude daguerreotypes of solemn-faced ancestors, locks of hair preserved in paper envelopes, and small personal effects meant to commemorate significant family members. "This belongs with the blood, whether you approve of how we kept it pure or not," Jebediah insisted. "It's the only history you and your children have." On the return journey to Roanoke, Martha examined the family record more closely. Beyond the disturbing documentation of consanguineous marriages lay a more complete history than she had previously known. Songs, remedies, stories, and traditions that had been passed down through generations of mountain isolation. The Thornhills had originated as Scots-Irish settlers who had found refuge in the mountains after fleeing religious persecution. Their gradual turn toward intermarriage had begun pragmatically in the face of limited options, before evolving into a deliberate practice rationalized by superstition and misunderstood genetics. There's truth here that shouldn't be lost, even if the practices were wrong, Martha told Samuel as they neared Roanoke. Your sister's children should know where they came from, not just the shameful parts that made the newspapers. This perspective marked an important shift in Martha's thinking, a recognition that acknowledging their troubled history didn't require either defending or completely rejecting their heritage. This nuanced view would prove crucial in the months ahead, as the family worked to build new lives while carrying the inescapable legacy of their blood. Upon their return, they found Rebecca had made a significant decision in their absence. Edward Pierce had connected her with an educational reformer named Eleanor Breckinridge, who operated a school for disadvantaged women in Richmond. Miss Breckinridge had offered Rebecca the opportunity to study there while arrangements were made for her son's care during class hours. I need to make something of myself beyond being a cautionary tale, Rebecca explained, her voice stronger and more determined than Martha had ever heard it. I want to learn to teach, so I can eventually help other girls from backgrounds like ours. Martha, holding the family record book, nodded slowly. Then you should also take this with you. Learn our whole history, the good and the terrible. Someday, you'll need to decide what parts to pass on to your son. The wooden box containing the Thornhill legacy changed hands, passing from mother to daughter in a moment of unspoken reconciliation. In this exchange lay the seed of how the family would ultimately process their complex inheritance, not through denial or shame, but through understanding and selective preservation of what deserved to be remembered. In Richmond, Rebecca would eventually become a valuable resource for Dr. Calloway's continuing research, providing insights into the social and psychological dimensions of isolated communities that no outside observer could offer. Her testimony before a legislative committee in 1887 helped secure funding for educational outreach to remote mountain areas, potentially preventing other families from following the Thornhills' path. The elderly Jebediah and Sarah Thornhill remained in the original homestead until a harsh winter claimed them both in early 1888. With no other relatives willing to claim the property, the cabin and land were eventually purchased by a timber company, erasing the physical evidence of the Thornhill legacy from Hollow Creek. Nature reclaimed the small family cemetery where generations of intermarried Thornhills lay buried, until only the most determined historical investigator could locate its overgrown remains. Back in Roanoke, Martha watched her grandchildren with a mixture of love and concern, always alert for signs of their genetic burden. Young James grew slowly, his development delayed but progressing. The twins, now approaching 20, would always require support and supervision. Silas, showing remarkable resilience, had begun apprenticing with a bookkeeper in town, his mathematical aptitude overcoming the limitations of his physical condition. "We carry our blood forward," Martha wrote in a letter to Rebecca in Richmond, "but we need not be defined by its darkest currents." 10 years after the Thornhill family's exodus from Hollow Creek, Dr. William Calloway published his definitive work on consanguinity in isolated Appalachian communities. Blood Ties, a scientific examination of inbreeding patterns in mountain populations. became an influential text in the emerging field of genetic studies, cited by researchers around the world. The Thornhill case featured prominently as the most extensively documented example of multi-generational consanguinity in modern medical literature. By 1896, the landscape of Virginia's mountain communities had changed significantly, partly due to the public attention generated by the Thornhill case. State-funded rural schools had been established in previously isolated hollows. Visiting nurses made regular circuits through remote areas. Methodist and Presbyterian mission societies maintained outposts, offering both spiritual guidance and practical education. The patterns of extreme isolation that had enabled families like the Thornhills to develop their own closed moral systems had begun to break down. For the Thornhill family themselves, the decade had brought both healing and ongoing challenges. Martha, now in her early 50s, but looking much older, had found purpose working with the Presbyterian Mission Society in Roanoke, using her knowledge of traditional mountain remedies to complement modern medical treatments. Her quiet dignity had gradually earned her respect within the community, and few now associated her with the sensational headlines of years past. Samuel had married a widow with 2 children of her own, establishing a home in the growing railroad town of Clifton Forge. His wedding represented a conscious break from the family's consanguineous history. His bride, Margaret Wilson, came from a Pennsylvania family with no connection to Virginia mountain stock. Their union produced 2 healthy daughters, evidence that the Thornhill genetic legacy could be diluted throughout breeding. Young Salus's defying expectations had overcome his physical limitations to become a respected bookkeeper for a mercantile company. Though his clubfoot still caused him pain and limited his mobility, his sharp mind and meticulous nature made him valued in his profession. At 22, he was courting a schoolteacher's daughter, his future seemingly unconstrained by his troubled origins. The twins, Elijah and Esther, presented more difficult cases. Their developmental limitations had become more pronounced with age, requiring constant supervision and care. After Martha became unable to manage them alone, they were placed in a state institution in Petersburg, a decision that brought Martha both relief and crushing guilt. Her monthly visits to the facility were emotional ordeals that left her bedridden for days afterward. It was Rebecca, however, whose transformation proved most remarkable. After 3 years of study with Eleanor Breckinridge in Richmond, she had returned to the mountains, not to Hollow Creek, but to Cedar Ridge, where she established a small school focused on educating isolated mountain girls. Funded partially by the Presbyterian Mission and partially by Dr. Calloway's Research Foundation, the school emphasized practical knowledge, literacy, and what Rebecca called window skills, abilities that allowed glimpses of the world beyond the mountains. Rebecca's son James, now 11, lived with her in the small house adjacent to the schoolhouse. The boy's limitations were evident, his speech remained impaired, his growth stunted, his features bearing the unmistakable markers of his consanguineous origin. Yet under his mother's patient guidance, he had developed skills that allowed him a measure of independence. He helped maintain the school grounds, tended a small garden, and assisted with simple tasks that played to his strengths. On a crisp October morning in 1896, exactly 11 years after the confrontation that had freed the Thornhill family from Ezra's control, an unexpected visitor arrived at Rebecca's school. Edward Pierce, now editor-in-chief of the Roanoke Daily Herald, had journeyed to Cedar Ridge to propose a new project, a comprehensive follow-up article examining the long-term outcomes of the case that had launched his journalistic career. "The public has largely forgotten the Thornhill name," Pierce explained as he and Rebecca walked the grounds of her small school. "But the changes your family's story prompted continue to reshape these mountains. I believe there's value in documenting how far we've come and how far we still must go." Rebecca, now 34, and carrying herself with the confident dignity of an educator, considered his proposal carefully. The years had softened her once sharp features, though observant eyes might still detect the haunted quality that never entirely left her gaze. "My students come from families not so different from mine," she finally responded. "Many are first-generation children being raised outside the patterns of isolation and intermarriage that shaped their parents and grandparents. Their stories are as important as mine." The resulting article, published as a special Sunday supplement, presented a nuanced examination of the Thornhill legacy. Rather than sensationalizing the consanguinity that had once captured public imagination, Pierce focused on the resilience demonstrated by the family's survivors and the systemic changes their case had helped initiate. Most poignantly, the article included excerpts from the journals Rebecca had kept since leaving Hollow Creek, documenting her evolution from victim to advocate. "The blood that flows through my veins and my sons is both burden and birthrights," she had written. "I cannot change its composition, but I can change its future course." Dr. Calloway contributed a scientific perspective, noting that the Thornhill case had advanced medical understanding of consanguinity's effects across multiple generations. "What we observe in the youngest Thornhill generation confirms our theories regarding accumulated genetic burden," he wrote. "Yet we also see evidence that outbreeding can rapidly dilute these effects, as demonstrated by Samuel Thornhill's healthy offspring." Martha, interviewed in her modest Roanoke home, offered perhaps the most profound reflection. "We were not monsters, though what happened in our family was monstrous. We were people shaped by isolation, ignorance, and traditions that should have been questioned sooner. The mountains both sheltered and imprisoned us until we could no longer tell the difference between protection and captivity." As Pierce prepared to leave Cedar Ridge, Rebecca presented him with a carefully wrapped package. Inside was the original Thornhill family record, its pages now augmented with Rebecca's own detailed annotations documenting the family's journey since leaving the mountain. "This belongs in the State Historical Society," she told him, "not as a curiosity, but as a warning and a testament. Other families like ours existed in these mountains, some still do, though fewer with each passing year. Their stories shouldn't be lost, even if they're painful to remember." That evening, after Pierce's departure, Rebecca sat on the porch of her small house, watching James feed chickens in the yard. Despite his limitations, there was joy in his movements as he scattered corn and observed the birds' eager response. This simple pleasure, Rebecca reflected, represented a kind of freedom neither she nor generations of her ancestors had experienced, the freedom to exist without the crushing weight of secret shame and isolated depravity. In her classroom the next morning, Rebecca faced 20 young girls from remote hollows and isolated homesteads. Many came from families with histories of consanguinity, though rarely as extreme as the Thornhills. Some showed subtle physical signs of inbred heritage, the close-set eyes, the distinctive facial proportions, all carried the invisible legacy of generations raised in isolation from mainstream society's evolving standards. "Today we discuss family trees," Rebecca announced, drawing a branching diagram on the blackboard. "In nature, trees branch outward, growing stronger through diversity. Human families follow the same principle." As she guided her students through the exercise of mapping their own lineages, tactfully helping them navigate the complicated connections many discovered, Rebecca embodied both warning and hope for the mountain communities. Her very existence testified to the darkest consequences of blood turned inward upon itself. Yet her transformation into an educator represented the possibility of breaking cycles that had persisted for generations. The Thornhill legacy would continue to echo through medical literature and social reform initiatives. Well into the 20th century, Dr. Calloway's research built substantially on their case, influenced early genetic studies, and helped shape public health approaches to isolated populations worldwide. The educational initiatives sparked by their story expanded over decades, gradually integrating even the most remote mountain communities into wider society. For Rebecca, however, legacy was measured in more immediate terms, in the growing confidence of her students, in her son's limited but genuine achievements, in the knowledge that no child in her care would ever experience what she had endured in Hollow Creek. "We cannot escape our blood," she wrote in her final journal entry of 1896. "It flows through us, carrying the accumulated choices of generations before us. But we can direct its future course away from the circular patterns that weakened us, toward new tributaries that bring strength through difference. This is my life's work, not to deny my origins, but to ensure they mark an ending rather than a continuation." In the decades that followed, the Thornhill name gradually faded from public consciousness, remembered primarily by medical researchers and social historians. The cabin in Hollow Creek collapsed into ruins, reclaimed by the forest until no visible trace remained of the family that had once maintained their purity at such devastating cost. The mountains kept their secrets, as they had for generations. Yet in the genes of scattered descendants, most unaware of their connection to the notorious case, the Thornhill blood continued its journey, increasingly diluted with each outbred generation. Rebecca's educational work ensured that dozens of young mountain women made different choices than their ancestors, marrying outside their immediate communities and breaking the cycles of consanguinity that had defined their family histories. If you've watched until here, it's because you appreciated this story. Leave a comment saying "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and find out who really enjoys the stories on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. These hidden family histories deserve to be told. Like this video and share it with someone who appreciates learning about the dark chapters of American history that textbooks never covered.